Easter just passed us by, when Christians around the world celebrate that Jesus was raised from the dead. As you can imagine, on a podcast like Faith That Seeks, this is like the question to explore, trying to keep faith and curiosity together. What I want to do in this episode is I want to talk specifically about this book, written by Dale Allison Jr. Allison is a professor of New Testament at Princeton Theological Seminary, and he recently wrote this wonderful book on the resurrection of Jesus. But before I get into his book, it'll help a lot to know what serious academics are saying about the resurrection of Jesus. So I'm not talking here about just what people popularly believe, which is its own thing to talk about, but serious academics who write about the resurrection of Jesus, as you can imagine, fall into two main camps. This is kind of an oversimplification, but it'll serve the purpose here. First camp is people who hold to a more or less traditional view, and a lot of these people pursue sort of a minimal historical facts view, and they say, okay, given the sources that we have available to us, it seems historically valid and certain that these minimal facts happened. And if you sort of break it down to those minimal facts, they'll say the most reasonable conclusion of what happened is that Jesus was actually raised from the dead. As you can imagine, most of these people are believers, but they will claim that their scholarship is guiding them and not their belief. We're going to consider that question as we go forward. Then there are those who are skeptical, and they will throw out various possible alternatives, and they won't necessarily disagree with some of those basic historical facts, but what they'll say is, but you're claiming that someone was actually raised from the dead. It's possible that there's a different explanation of why these things were recorded and remembered and passed on the way that they were. So, two basic camps. Well, in comes Dale Allison Jr., and I would like to talk specifically about this book, in part because of a quotation that I'll read for you from page 3, because I think he really gets part of what's going on with why people believe or don't believe Jesus' resurrection. He says on page 3, probably most readers will close this book with the same beliefs they held when they opened it. It is truly hard to change one's mind about emotionally charged subjects. We may profess to love the truth, but none of us doggedly wants the truth in the way that a drowning person desperately, unrelentingly struggles for air. What we really long for, if we are candid, is justification of what we already believe. So, whether you agree with that statement or not, that's something interesting to think about, and I think we can all pretty much recognize that there are certainly people in the world, even if we're excluded, who want to justify their beliefs and don't really enter into emotionally charged subjects open to change their mind. The resurrection of Jesus, Allison claims, is one of those things that we find really hard to change our minds about. But Allison dives into this trying to be as open and honest as possible, recognizing, I think, that he's not accepted from what he just said about our desire for the truth. But the book is really, parts of it are really not for the general audience, but parts of it I think anyone would find fascinating. Okay, so before I get into kind of the main conclusions that Allison comes to, I want to tell you just about one part of the book. The book is divided into 4 parts, and one of those parts is particularly interesting and I think worth buying this book for. So a lot of scholars, when it comes to the resurrection of Jesus, won't really talk about other parallels a whole lot, or they'll dismiss them as really not the same thing. But Allison talks about tons of stuff. And by parallels, he doesn't mean things that are exactly the same, because nothing is exactly the same. But he talks about supposed supernatural events that were pretty well attested in the same way that we would say the resurrection of Jesus was well attested. So among these things, he mentions, and this will sound bizarre to some of you, but stick with me. He mentions Tibetan Buddhist monks who some of them died, and they gave instructions about their body. They said, make sure it's not buried for a certain amount of time. And what reportedly happens in these cases is the body shrinks a little bit, like each day, and then by the end of the period, all that's left is hair and nails, and that's like something that shows up often in these accounts. And there's a rainbow that forms over the place where the body is. So this is called rainbow body. So certain monks, it is thought, can achieve rainbow body. Now, I know that sounds bizarre, but imagine that you are writing a book about Jesus' resurrection, and you have an apologetic angle, meaning you are trying to convince people that this is reasonable and even that this is the best thing to conclude happened, that Jesus was raised from the dead. But then you come to something like this and you say, well, that just couldn't possibly have happened. Allison brings it up to get us to think, why do we believe the things that we believe? Why accept miracle A and not miracle B, when miracle B maybe has the same amount of attestation and reason to believe the witnesses that miracle A does? So, really interesting thing to consider. Another example that he gives is something that happened in Zaytun, Egypt in 1968. I don't know how I didn't know about this. Maybe I had heard about it before and passed it off at the time. But in 1968, a couple of men saw what they thought was a woman who was about to commit suicide on the top of St. Mary's Cathedral in Zaytun. And so they contacted the appropriate people, and people end up showing up. They see this luminous body of what everyone came to, not everyone, but what people would show up in droves to think was Mary, the Virgin Mary herself. These visions kept appearing, and I mean, electricity was even cut off to the area so that if someone was playing a hoax, it wouldn't happen. The apparitions still showed up. Because this happened in 1968, there is even photographic evidence of this. Now, Allison shares this to once again show, like, there is stuff out there that's really strange that has really good attestation. Now, he doesn't therefore just believe any of this, but he throws it out there to say, stuff happens. Now, this leads me to one of the most interesting things about this section of the book, because the author himself has experienced crazy stuff, including a deceased friend whom he had a vision of after her death. So one night he wakes up and there is his friend. She's sort of, very, very bright. He said she appeared real. She didn't look like a ghost or something. She seemed to actually be there. It filled him with a sense of peace. Later, another day after that, he heard her clearly speaking to him and telling him that he should visit her late husband. So, weird stuff. There's more that he shares from his personal life. His father, several members of his family had experiences of him after he died. And so Allison shares that. He goes into lots of the literature about this sort of thing. He has actually been criticized for bringing this stuff up, but then he kind of responds with, but we are asking whether a supernatural phenomenon can be historically validated. So shouldn't we think of other so-called supernatural phenomena and whether they can be or should be considered historically verifiable? So Really interesting section. And here's what I want to think about. Do those experiences that he had or that he reports, do they make Allison more likely to believe that Jesus was raised from the dead or not? You can actually see how that evidence could go both ways. On the one hand, he could say, well, yeah, that just shows that supernatural stuff happens. I believe firmly that it did happen. But on the other hand, you could say, well, strange stuff happens, and so maybe something strange happened with Jesus, but maybe lots of strange stuff happens. So maybe it wasn't unique. So what Allison's mainly trying to do here is not to dismiss the resurrection of Jesus because of these so-called parallels. He's not claiming they're the same. So a skeptic might do that. But he's also not ignoring these things or saying that they're just not like the resurrection of Jesus in any way. He points out, as one argument from a believer might come, well, people, touched Jesus and he was real. He says, actually, a lot of these reports of deceased loved ones, people will actually report touching the person and that they're actually bodily there, or so they think. Again, we can do whatever we want with these reports. We can not believe them. We can believe them. But his point is, lots of crazy stuff has been reported. Make of that what you will. Okay, so what does Allison think is pretty much something you can reconstruct historically as what happened surrounding the resurrection of Jesus? Well, I'll just read a quote of him summarizing his own findings, and that is found on page 336. He says, my main historical conclusions in part 2 are, within the broader context of critical study of the New Testament, quite conservative. They indeed border on the embarrassingly antediluvian. Joseph of Arimathea, a member of the Sanhedrin, buried Jesus, perhaps in a family tomb. Shortly thereafter, some of Jesus' female followers found the entrance to that tomb open, his body gone. After that, likely quite soon after that, at least one of them, Mary Magdalene, had a vision of Jesus. Sometime later in Galilee, Peter, probably aware of the story of the empty tomb, as well as of Mary's encounter and presumably her interpretation of it, also believed that he had met Jesus. Not long after that, the apostle and his companions returned to Jerusalem, where they began to proclaim that God had raised Jesus from the dead. By that time, additional members of the 12 had become convinced that they too had seen their Lord, whether in Galilee and or Jerusalem. Months or even years after that, something happened to convince members of a large crowd, more than 500 according to Paul, that they too had beheld Jesus. Subsequently, Jesus' brother James made the same claim, and eventually also Paul of Tarsus. So that's, like he said, a really conservative conclusion as to what he think actually happened. A good historical reconstruction of what seems to have taken place. So does that just leave him to say, okay, investigation over, Jesus was raised from the dead? Well, he does affirm everything he just said, and yet he has more to say. So he, wanting to be as honest as possible, puts himself in the shoes of a skeptic, making clear he is not a skeptic, but he puts himself in the shoes of a skeptic, and he says the following. Welcome or not, this is on page 356, welcome or not, ostensible encounters with the newly departed are not uncommon, and people often perceive apparitions not as ghostly shades, but as solid as wholly real. Furthermore, group visions appear in the religious and parapsychological records. What then restrains skeptics who have less confidence in the historicity of the biblical reports than do the Orthodox from regarding the resurrection appearances, transphysicality and all, transphysicality being a term that N.T. Wright threw out for Jesus sort of being, I don't want to put words in his mouth, but sort of between flesh and blood like we are and something quite different. But what keeps them from regarding the resurrection appearances as not being beyond compare? He says, mix in the pre-Easter eschatological expectations of the disciples, by which he means, Jesus taught things, they were aware of certain Jewish teachings, and so maybe Jesus dies and they think, oh, based on what we know about resurrection, let's apply that to Jesus. So based on these expectations pre-Easter of the disciples, he continues, the theft of Jesus' body and a knowledge of how messianic movements, such as Chabad in our own day, can become theologically innovative in the light of unexpected events, and one might claim, there it is. So the skeptic can't really explain exactly what happened, but for the skeptic, that's not really the point. The Chabad incident that he mentions there is a failed messianic movement where the followers, many of them, sort of picked up the pieces and made sense of it moving on. Now you can look at that and say, yeah, but you don't have the same focused intensity of belief about a single way of looking at that. But Allison's trying to put himself into the shoes of a skeptic, and he says, okay, if you acknowledge that supernatural things or seemingly supernatural things can happen, whether you're a person who doesn't allow those things to happen at all, or one who does, either way you can say, well, there's all kinds of reports like that out there. It doesn't mean that I have to believe it, or it doesn't mean that I have to believe it and therefore become a Christian. So this book is, I think, it lives up to the effort that he throws out there in the front, in the beginning, to try to really be honest about this subject, whether it pleases the converted or the skeptical is really not his aim, which shouldn't be his aim at all if he's approaching this as a scholar. So Allison finally says, while I do not dispute any of the apologists' minimal facts or historical bedrock, I remain far less sanguine than they about what follows. That's page 358. So he has his beliefs. He's a Christian. He says he'll be at Easter, or he'll be in church next Easter, but he doesn't want to claim too much. So that leads me to talk about something that I think is really important to get at if we're ever going to understand what's going on with people believing in the resurrection or not. And that is the question, why do we believe? Why do we believe certain things, especially the resurrection? But why do we believe? And I want to throw out just a couple of surprising people out there who you would expect to believe, but who didn't. One of them is named Jacqueline Duffin. She is a prominent medical historian, wrote a book in Oxford University Press where she investigated the Vatican's canonization records of saints. And she says that they do indeed, this is quoting Allison's book on page 325, she says they do indeed document some truly enigmatic events, healings that defy explanation. She, Allison says, however, is an atheist. So she investigates these canonization records in the Vatican, and she's like, oh wow, like some of this stuff really does defy natural explanation. But it doesn't change her worldview. Here's another person, similarly. This person, Pincus Lapide, was a Jewish scholar who decided to research the resurrection of Jesus. Very interesting case, just, decides to explore this historically. Surprisingly, he comes to say, the historical evidence leads me to believe that Jesus of Nazareth was raised from the dead. Okay? Well, he becomes a Christian, right? No. What he does is he fits that into his larger Jewish worldview. And he says, well, Jesus must have been this Messiah for the Gentiles. The Jews still await their Messiah. And so you can agree to certain facts and still hold a worldview that's unexpected. So, can we, in other words, look to something like the resurrection of Jesus, hand someone a book, and say, just follow these facts and you should believe? Now, I don't want to say, because I don't want to be, I don't know, I don't want to be pessimistic about this, but I don't want to say that someone can't come to faith that way. But I think there's a lot more going on than just accepting the facts, because I think if someone reads a book, and by the way, if someone wants to believe in the resurrection of Jesus and they're not sure that they can, probably this would be a great book to hand them if they can get through 700 pages. This is by N.T. Wright, wonderful book on the resurrection of Jesus. But what if someone doesn't want to believe? What if they maybe find themselves open, but like Pincus Lapide, they conclude something that seems weird to us? Well, Jesus was raised from the dead, but I'm not going to become a Christian as a result. I think there's a lot more going on than just the facts. Allison himself says on page 298, it is not always the case that the more one learns, the clearer a matter becomes. So for Allison, like I said, he is a Christian. However, he thinks that the more he's learned, the stranger reality has gotten, and it isn't always clearer. I also want to read a couple of other quotes from him that are helpful in this regard. He says, history is not all there is. One can gather the historical data or likely facts and drop them into the more expansive arenas of philosophy and theology, in the hope that additional knowledge will enable us to sort through the competing alternatives, including competing religious traditions. So, in other words, what he's saying is, if you look into history about this and you decide, okay, here's what seems historically valid, there's a lot more to look into, and inquiring minds might want to fit this into their philosophy and their theology. Certainly that happened with someone like Pincus Lapide, who had a theology that he thought he could fit this into. Allison also says on page 365, and this is, I think, really important as to what is going on when it comes to belief. Allison says in sort of a conclusion to his book, a coda, he calls it, C-O-D-A, he says, or as the Beatitude has it, the pure in heart see God. That is an epistemological statement, and it implies that we require more than critical study if we are to find what may lie beyond historical finitude. An epistemological statement, what do I mean by that? The pure in heart see God. Allison says, how do we know things? How do we come to know things? How do we come to believe things? Well, he's claiming Jesus saying the pure in heart see God, will see God, is a question of how we know. If you don't seek purity, will you find the one who is pure? Again, another way of him saying there's a lot more going on in how and why we believe anything. He concludes his book with a final sentence that I'll read for you. For myself, all I have to do is look up at the night sky or look into the face of my neighbor, and then I know that there is more to life than faith than this. So, what about me? What about my opinion? I think that the resurrection makes sense historically. In my past, I have been the person to sort of look at the minimal facts historically and say, wow, this really bolsters my faith. It didn't give me faith, but it did bolster my faith. And I think, if you're perhaps like that, where the historical facts sort of bolster your faith, I think that's great. But at the same time, what I want to communicate about my own take on the resurrection is that history does not leave me satisfied. Like Thomas, or unlike Thomas, I can't put my hands into Jesus's hands and side and say, okay, I've got the historical facts, I'm holding on to them, I'm good to go. I'm still left with history with sort of this haze afterward, because you put all the facts together and you say, yes, believable. But then your human mind returns to, but is piecing together historical facts the same as believing that a truly miraculous thing happened? I'm not so sure. What do I cling to when I believe in the resurrection? For me, a lot of it is making sense of the Bible's grand story. To me, the resurrection makes sense of something that's been going on since Genesis, something that the Bible is sort of trying to hint at, something that makes for a lot of indirection, but then all of a sudden is resolved if you're paying attention. But even that is you have to pay very close attention and in the right way. And of course, interpretations go off in all kinds of ways. So it is just about impossible to sit someone down and say, okay, listen to my interpretation of this and follow me at every point, and then you'll see. I think there's a lot more going on in why we believe that Jesus was raised from the dead, or why we don't believe. And I don't pretend to make this video so that you will just say, okay, can I believe? Yes. Because I think maybe that simplistic approach can cheapen what is actually going on in the faith process. And maybe it can cheapen what God actually wants for us as he draws our hearts to faith.